Chapter 2. Further Afield. Many times I've taken this journey, and every year it feels a longer way, where I might have once found safety where he gnaws through me, and I must hold to my faith that our ways have stymied aggression. From the Journal of Finley Artifer. It was 2 hours later that they finally passed the edge of Minhir, where the west gate was raised high against the wilderness. A long wall spanned a mile in either direction from the gates themselves. The southern wall wrapped around the bend of the Ale Stream, while the north wall angled slightly back towards the city. Beyond, not far past the hill that barred their view, a bridge lay awaiting the hooves and wheels that carried them. The proper road went on, but grew wilder and less tended with every mile that they went. Soft earth and thin gravel became raw and clumpy, and on either side the hills rose here and there to block the wilds beyond their sight. With the bridge behind them, they faced the midland of the Island of Songs. It was an expanse of gold and green fields, further stretching than any eye or weather would permit. For a long ways they found no trees, and only wheat and the occasional farmhouse marked their distance. The going slowed once the road was withered before them, and what had once felt like quick travel drained hours away like water from a torn and ragged bucket. The lidless eyes of the sun wore on those who were beneath it, and the heat, growing in the later afternoon, started to seem rather tiresome. Finley wiped his face, the sweat beading on his brow as the hot wind blew over him. He dragged his jacket from his arms and tucked it behind him in the saddle. At once he was refreshed, but having finished his wine, he craved proper drink to give him strength. He pulled his canteen from his side and drank deep of the cool, crisp water within. The heat that dragged its tingling claws across his flesh was wiped cleanly away, and with that was a relief that could not be understated. Behind him, he heard dull bickering over some small matter, and for a while ignored it, but at length it gnawed at his ears, and with a straining of his eyes he glanced backwards at Swain.
"Oh, but I've been dying to,"
Swain argued, and Elise flashed him a forbidding look. "So early? We've only just started, and we might have plenty for ourselves, but we've a week to go each way. We needn't waste it here," Elise retorted, but Swain seemed not to be listening. His reddish eyes were looking ever towards the box of red fog at his side, and with each moment he seemed more likely to snap the top open and dig his hands in. After some minutes in silence, he did just that.
"Won't be fresh enough to chew forever. Just look at it. Some leaves are already drying out," he complained energetically, not giving Elise a chance to stop him before he stuffed 2 leaves against his gums. Between the chomping and sucking sounds, his face, once tones of yellow and gray splashed with a tinge of red from his blood beneath, went ever warmer as he slid back and fell into a peaceful relaxation. He smiled and sighed, and in his voice was pleasure and restful strength of will. "You animal,"
Elise mocked, and though Everett glanced back at the playful insult, they were not in common company now, and such mocking was to be expected with the group they'd assembled. Finley reached a hand backwards and off to the side, where Everett saw it quickly and did a similar thing.
"Dry, if you would.
I've no love of the flavor on my tongue," Finley requested, and Everett nodded. Elise handed him a few drier leaves, which threatened to crumble at the touch. They were passed along, and Finley gathered them in his palm and crushed them in a hard grip. He pinched them, small bits at a time, into a pipe that he pulled from his pocket, tamping them down with his pinky before striking a match against a hard portion of the saddle and lighting the edges. He breathed deep, and sucked plumes of the dark red smoke into his chest. He held them there for a while and gave a quavering breath outward as he shivered from the warmth that ran through his every vein and his body. His being, as if being filled by warm coffee, felt somehow sweet, numb, and hot. The feeling provided was so hard to put into words that seldom did anyone try. Still, his best comparison would have started with the way that one feels when first lying down after a long and exhausted day, dragged further into one's very blood being replaced by bath water as they drink their favorite drink and feel satisfied by a meal that had been perfectly prepared and portioned. It was like the relief of the first breath after holding one's mouth and nose closed until their body shook and shivered, like the first drink of water after days of drought. He smiled, wide and pure, and his teeth were shown wholly as he did. He glanced upward and judged the sun to divine the time. From its position, he marked it as nearing 5 in the afternoon, and though it had felt like far longer, he knew that the next leg of the journey would go hard and fast, and thus he had no quarrel with indulging in the smoke of the taggart leaf. Finley himself had some small pleasures of his own tucked away. just in case things were to grow weary beyond normal measure. He'd inherited his family's love for the growth of the forest floor, for the fields of flowers and the thickets of dense trees. He had a deep connection with everything growing, and he'd proven quite the capable craftsman and herbalist in his short years. He had a rare summer cordial in his bag, and though he had not perfected it, it was brewed a month earlier in preparation for his journey. Mint leaves and gooseberries, lilac, poppy, and willow bark. It was brewed down and tinctured until the mix was pure and thick, laden with honey to sweeten the once bitter and floral tastes. Were he to take a fall and hurt himself, red fog would prove somewhat lesser to his pain, and while lesser pain would fall away before the smoke, a broken leg or rib may just prove too much to overcome. In those cases, his cordial would do more than enough, and better still, it could bring sleep when nature proved loud and boisterous in the night. It was no cure-all, but for deep sleep and sharp pain, it would serve better than most things. The road before them, now little more than a seldom trodden ground, snaked away into the distance. It dug between tall hillocks and around smaller fields with their farmhouses tucked away into the rock and stone of the crags nearest to the river. Their planned journey would take them many miles west, across the plains and into the southern wood, where strange stories from years past would surely be told to calm their nerves. Beyond that, they would follow the base of the mountains until they reached the Ale Stream once more and would pass over it to reach Fairhill. This portion alone was a 5-day journey on foot, though their horses and wagons would make it nearer to 3 if weather and rocky path allowed. For the first day at least, they would not encounter many trees or hard passages. Even the crags that were starting to pop up on either side of them didn't prove difficult, as they'd moved this way many times over the years. It was their usual path, and while things remained steady, it would be a simple enough thing to manage on schedule. They built a day into their time to give a buffer for foul weather, and hoped that it would be enough. As the rocks started to grow heavy and sharp around them, they were thankful for the dirt road on which they walked. Nim proved to have no problem walking over tough stone, but the wagon was another matter, and if the path were more jagged, they'd have been forced to find another way. They stole along the edge of a ravine, carefully navigating the winding paths as small stones trickled down the edge and into the abyss below. Finley thanked the old Sif that this valley was narrow and not long, and that before the hour was done they would have put it behind them. It would have been anxious work to navigate, but Swain had either thought ahead, or his impatience had proven serendipitous, as their nerves were still and solid as could be, thanks to their smoke and chew. Nim led them through the narrow walkway, and in short order the wagon followed. On the left side, towards the south, a solid face of rock climbed ever upwards, barring the forest from their view. Sharply angled rocks dug outward at them and threatened always to catch the unwary by the head, knocking them down into the darkened crevice that hung down on their right. The road itself was unsteady, and though many of the rocks there had been flattened and made passable, a great many more dug up at the hooves of the horses. To travel this way on foot was often quite dangerous, as the dizzy feeling gained by being pinched between such steep faces made the mind swirl. Steps would often become even more unsteady, and a stray step would mean certain death to the one who made it. Nim was a capable navigator, though, and guided the wagon through and along the narrow pathways in the crags. At length, they came to the first fork in the road, and on either side the cliffs stretched high. The path that they traveled was still bordered on the right by the chasm, but a single, thin walkway bridged the gap to the other side, where things seemed mirrored, with the cliff to the north and the chasm south. "The left," Everett said plainly, though Finley glanced here and there with deep thought. His mind was revealed quickly, though not by himself but by Nim, who warily approached the forward path and stamped against the ground. He appeared to be checking the ground for cracks and weaknesses, and continued to do so as he inched forward along the path. Outward and upward, the path ahead stretched on, and climbed quickly out from the crags again. Through the gap in the cliffs, a few stray trees could be seen growing against the firmament. They were dead and gnarled, their roots seeming to hold the very cliffs together. Still, they were quite old, and their roots shed columns of dusty splinters with every bump that the wagon made. Finley's eyes were glancing ever up towards the thin sliver of light that was growing higher and further above them. For a moment, he felt a bite of fear, a feeling he couldn't explain as his eyes couldn't even register a detail in the half-moment he thought he might have seen something. He gathered himself, though his curiosity persisted for a few steps as they trudged, ever more slowly, along the ragged trail. A tree lay a dozen feet ahead, just along the edge of the narrow slit above them, and as Finley spied it, he felt wearied by concern. He couldn't bury it. and it seemed to jump from his very mind into that of his mount. Nim stopped and went rigid. On his back, Finley was stock still, and his eyes were locked on a narrow crack in the rock ahead, splitting the path in two, left and right. The Last Crags, they were called, and earned their name for the many travelers who, weary from hours of travel from either side, could easily become lost or slip down through the shadowy sea that the sun seemed unable to illuminate. A raw, dense smoke churned deep in the valley, and therein Finley could swear that he saw something moving, but was ever unsure if his fears were tilting his mind towards things imagined rather than concrete. Nim's behavior only further inspired his worry. Finley raised a hand, realizing the difficulty they would face from his choice, but knowing better what could be faced if he didn't speak fast. "We need to back up," Finley insisted, and his companions groaned loudly. "What do you mean, back up? We can't back up, we're in a forward-led wagon. What do you want us to do, pull it?" Elise complained. "That's exactly what I want you to do," Finley confirmed. He might not have convinced her on his own, but between Nim's tentative stamping and Swain's urging, the two in the wagon climbed out, and began the long and arduous task of drawing the wagon back a few 100 feet along the precipice. There was no room to pass on either side, as the cliff pinched the road closely to the chasm and would bear no weight on the very edge. A small child might have been able to inch by the wagon, but certainly not a fully grown Sif. They had hardly moved a dozen feet when one of the trees, still before Finley and Everett's faces they looked forward and moved back, fell with a boom and crashed against the path just where they would have been a short time later. Things became very still for a moment as the tree vanished through the foggy pit. They listened, rocks tumbling and cracking as they danced down the crag, and for a while it seemed unlikely that any sound could bring them more distress than that which they'd just heard. They were quickly proven wrong, as the deep thum of the tree striking the bottom far away rattled the whole of the cliffside. Like shale, the edge of the path started to shear away in sheets, and they fell with the force of a mountain downward. Rocks started to fall around them, and the road only grew narrower as they desperately scrambled back. The road opened slowly, though the pressure and tension of the situation was tightening like a vice around the minds of the company, and the only one who seemed capable of speech was Finley. It was not for his own strength that he could still speak, however, as he was just as terrified as his friends, but Nim's confident movements were the source of his remaining voice instead. Nim circled for a moment and moved without bidding. He jumped across the chasm and landed on one of the thin pillars of rock in the center. It cracked and buckled beneath his weight, but he was leaping again before the column gave way, jumping back to the road on the other side of the wagon and lowering his neck. Finley reached down and gathered the ropes that his friends were tugging, and between his grip and Nim's strong step, the horses reared and complained loudly as the wagon tugged against them. They seemed to dislike being pulled backwards a great deal, and with Nim no longer beside them, their panic was beginning to grow. The wagon moved just in time as the pathway, long ago hewn from the very rock, fell away entirely. It had only halted when the cracks crashed against the narrow walkway between the cliff, and even then it rattled from the crashing rocks around the base of the valley. The wagon was released at once, and the horses reared, galloping forward carelessly across the thin path. It started to crumble and separate, cracking before Finley could move over its length. Nim would not venture further, and Swain had stayed back out of some fear or grim apprehension. Elise had jumped at once onto the wagon, and had thusly made it across before the passing fell away. The earth shook and grumbled deeply. The very ground beneath them sighed to show the end of its long tantrum, and though its anger still seemed to groan and tremble, it was contained behind the shell of hard rock once more. Everett managed to get the horses under control, and from a few dozen feet down the northern path, he shouted back. "Well, that's just a lovely start to all this, isn't it? I'm not suspicious, mind you, but I'd think this was an omen." "We'll need to find another way forward," Swain started, but Finley had already gathered his thoughts, having done so as Nim did the thinking during what felt like their darkest moments. "I have another way, but it's long and harder than we faced so far. Still, it's no comfort for you both to wait in this forsaken place. Go on ahead, wait for us until daybreak and Schnee, and should we be delayed further, you're not to wait for us." "You can't mean," Everett started. "Traditions, Everett, old Sif. Ever you emphasize their importance, and so to them for now I'll hold. It was you who forbade me to make such trouble as I can avoid, and to that I'll hold as well. We've promised the gifts that you have in that wagon, and with us there or not, those must go on. A silly thing, I'll not deny, but if you preach about all the things that I don't understand, then at least hold to it yourself, and don't delay further." The ground still trembled, and far above them, through the widened crack of sunlight, a flock of birds fled from the wrath of the earth deep below. "There, see? Even now, Herogath herself cries out for you to leave, and should you deny her, I do not think she'll forgive. No, not even as forgiving as she is the Sith who holds so strict tradition." With that, Finley said no more, and simply glared through the bright eyes of Violet and Cobalt. A flickering flame burned within his gaze, and it was powerful enough to set alight the resistant walls in Everett's mind. Elise tried to protest, but even as her voice came through, it was trampled beneath a cascade of hoofbeats on hard rock. They faded from view, and Swain looked questioningly at his companion, with whom he was now alone. "You have your presence there," Swain pointed to the saddle, and Finley simply smiled at him. "I do indeed, with food and drink enough to allow us a free and calming journey to Schnee. We've no need of over-hasty movements today, not after that catastrophe, but still, to wait, at least for them, would have been a mistake not lightly thrown aside. Look at the cliffside." Swain did as he was bid, and there saw that on the far side of the ravine, the road was cracked violently in two, right along the center. Well, say what you will about Finley Artifer, but he's certainly not selfish or stupid. Strange, there can be no doubt, however. Finley smiled again, this time wider. "Much obliged for the kind word, but we should move, for our side splinter, and we meet a fate far worse than simple death. To break our legs and lie down in darkness until we are well forgotten." Finley shuddered. "That would be a foul birthday." They wheeled around and started back down the slithering pathway. The world felt strangely silent after such a commotion, and when the rumbling had fully ceased, not a singular word could be heard. Swain gasped suddenly, not a minute after the start of their retreat from the rocky pathway. "You're bleeding!" Swain cried, and his voice bounced back and forth and back again between the cliff walls on either side. Finley looked down, glancing over himself until finally his eyes fell upon his thigh where a long slice had been made through the sable of his breeches. The cloth was somewhat folded into his flesh, and his pocket had been ripped away under the sundered tear. The contents of his pocket remained, and therein he ensured that his belongings still held fast where they had before. The two satchels were there, and the knife had gone undamaged in its sheath above. Finley said nothing, and merely shrugged. He reached into his vest pocket and drew out a small crystal vial. He placed a few droplets on his tongue, and the strong smells of mint and many fruits and other spices wafted over the area. The cordial worked quickly and took the sudden sting away from his leg. He didn't indulge much, and a few drops would serve him to get through the crag without tending to the wound more closely. Still, he watched it from then on, and his eyes seldom went a minute without darting to it and watching for further cuts or tears. He was unsure when he'd gained such a wound, but assumed that it was likely during his quick turnaround during their struggle. The jagged shards of rock that loomed from his side were certainly sharp enough to make a mark like that, and it seemed the most obvious cause. Still, Swain's eyes had been drawn from the blood to the knife that dangled from Finley's side, and with a great many words on his wary and slightly panicked mind, Swain needed to speak. "I was wondering about that new knife of yours. Never seen you dote a sheath on your belt after all, and I couldn't help but consider that it seemed like a strange time to start," Swain began, but Finley held back an answer. He knew a longer query was bound to come forth. Of all the long-winded Sith that Finley had ever met, Swain was the most loose-spoken and unconcise. "You've always had a love of gardens and things that grow, but you never wear a tool belt or sport a proper trowel. Strange that, after all. You've always dug in the dirt with your hands and nails, and it only just occurred to me how queer a behavior that really is. I mean, old Sif Farley, even with his wrinkled, useless fingers, still carried a bag around his garden when he tried uselessly to trim all his flowers. Granted, when his grandbabs would come and help him, they'd reach into his satchel, so I guess it wasn't purposeless." Finley began to grow somewhat tired of the rambling, but out of respect and want for distraction while navigating the still treacherous path, he bit his tongue. "But there you are outside the inn, and there's this knife on your waist. Like I said, I had to be curious, but figured you'd mention it. We're a business worth mentioning. Then I wonders if you might have some secret, so I didn't want to spoil it in the company of others. But here we are, alone, and so I ask." "You've all but asked a dozen times already, Swain," Finley chuckled mirthfully. "It's my grandfather's knife, simple as that." Finley caught himself in the lie, noticing that he hadn't really thought much more of it in that moment. The same blurred memory dug its way to the surface, and once more he could scarcely picture the strangeness in his head that was the blade's mirrored edge. He looked thoughtful, considering whether it was worth questioning. With a short, internal debate, he judged that he'd only come to understand the thing if he spoke of it plainly. Clearing his throat, he amended his statement. "Well, no, it's not just that. I confess, I don't know why I spoke of it so plainly. It's anything but plain. My very thoughts of it are confused and somewhat strangled under shadow and doubt. It's like the most unlikely of stories when I try to consider it, and the very things I've seen myself seem strange beyond understanding. It all just seems false, if you take my meaning." "I'm not sure that I do, but continue if you've a mind to. You certainly spun an interesting start." Finley thought hard on how to broach the subject, though he always watched his pathway, trusting to Nim to navigate while other minds looked elsewhere. "Well, when I hold it, I feel strange. I feel a better nature in me, the way that no other knife should feel. A knife in hand should make one want to carve, should bring thoughts of cutting, but somehow this thing makes me think instead of mending. Stranger still, I can't see myself in the steel of it. Moreover, trees shift in their image like a reflection in water freshly disturbed, and glow with a faint and thumping light beyond my ability to describe properly. It certainly was my granddad's, but maybe he was strange after all. Strange enough to own a thing that I myself can't hope to explain or understand without far brighter minds turning to muse over it." "Sounds strange indeed. Sure you've not smoked too much? The leaf can make things rather, odd in the best of times." "I'm quite certain," Finley chuckled. "Not 2 puffs have I smoked of yet, and at your mention I feel maybe I need another to help me off this path. I assume you pocketed a few of the leaves to chew?" Swain went flush with a golden tinge. Finley laughed at him merrily, adjusting in his saddle. "Well, you know, I didn't want to make a fuss if I wanted more," Swain admitted, but it was purposeless, as he was not begrudged for what was expected behavior. "Up here on the right. We're taking the side path into the upper crags." "Oh, you've a plan then?" Swain asked, his flush fading. "Good, I was worried." "No need. Nim can navigate the steeper crags, and they'll serve us better. They're sturdier. If you tire, you can climb up and ride with me." Swain shook his head. "You might be strange enough to ride a horse like that, but I'm certainly not at home in a saddle. You can have that to yourself." Finley shrugged, expecting that before long Swain would be exhausted and strained from a much steeper approach to their goal. As they turned aside from the road, Nim climbed over some small, knee-high rocks that barred them from the upper crags. It was no path at all in the end, and was more of an off-road climb through wickedly sharp rocks and dangerous, tumultuous hillocks of granite. Finley had been quite right, as the ground was steady and showed no movement, and indeed barely gave a sound as Nim's hooves clapped down against it. Above them, some 20 feet, the cliffs gave way to thin trees and sprigs of youthful wood. Boughs of young pine and sycamore spanned the upper edges of the angled, steep path that they climbed. With each step they approached the surface again, and the sun, once a narrow slit providing no hope and indeed very little light, had become a wide swath of open air above them. The cloudless sky sang in greeting to them, and the wind embraced their faces as they first rose above the level of the cliffs. They were not clear of the crag, but rather on the southern edge of it, and would need to navigate through some difficult areas from there in order to head north to their destination. Day drained away into evening, and the sun had begun to set. In the distant west, beyond the peaks so far off on the other side of the island near Alemwar, the highest peak seemed crowned by a nimbus of gold. Light carried over the smaller peaks like a glimmering cloak and appeared broached by an amber and red gemstone where the fog curled and bent the light. The horizon had become a large scar, and like a gaping wound the sky bled crimson which spanned halfway across the endless expanse in the heavens. The trees caught the wind and arched to and fro from it. The strong gusts of a much colder evening seemed likely to snap the thin boughs of the young trees that lined the southern fields. Westward, larger trees could be seen a few miles off, an old forest that would serve as the border for their journey north. For some time they traveled in silence, and what warmth the autumn day had brought was stolen away. In its place, a bitter chill, the breath of harsh stone mausoleums, strayed across the rocky outcrops. The skies seemed to grasp and pant, and each breath it cast down against them was colder than the last. Tears formed in their large eyes as they felt they might freeze on their cheeks with each sharp gale. They passed through a narrow stretch of stone, and there they broke into the proper wilds once more. Though there was still a great deal of stony badlands before them, the trees that hugged either side of their newly chosen path provided some small comfort and shielded them from the horrid winds. They came into a small, thick copse and wandered through it into a clearing. The strong scent of fresh pine sap called back to old memories that they shared in childhood. Their minds were lightened by thoughts of easier days, and it did wonders for their spirits. Where the corruption and stains of stress and ill luck had deeply discolored their usual mood, their memories washed clean the paints of disdain and worry. Finley pulled a large fur cloak from his rucksack and gathered a thinner sweater for Swain, who had nothing of his own to warm his chattering bones. Finley offered the fur cloak first, but Swain refused it, reaching up and grabbing the sweater instead and wrapping it about himself. He huddled his arms together over his chest and blew hot breaths into his trembling hands. He rubbed them together desperately, and Finley gave a sigh in surrender. "We should get warmer, then set off again once we've had our supper. No point going on without any food to warm us, is there?" Swain shook his head vehemently and thumped down to the ground. Swain was a slightly larger fellow, not fat by any means, but rotund, despite the thick layer of muscle beneath his rounded form. He'd always been a strong fellow, though sometimes a bit cowardly and awkward, but one thing beyond question was his nature. He was a good-hearted sif and loved community and merrymaking more than most. He was uncommon in attitude, though not so much as Finley, who'd proved desperately different to most. He sat and huddled together to stay warm while Finley slid from his saddle and set his packs down in a small pile beside them. Nim, with unspoken leave from his master, galloped away to find food and fresh water, which were much desired after a long day of hard work. He wouldn't return for hours, and in that time his belly would be full and his taste for water would be well sated. Swain was exhausted, and Finley reckoned to himself that a bit of weight shed through hard work would do him well. He was heavy, as far as Sif went, and tended to tire more easily than most. Still, it was a thankful thing for him to be there, as Finley himself had much to do, and it would be too busy to cook a proper meal to help them along through the night. "We've far to go and no time to sleep or shut our eyes for more than a few minutes. Still, get some rest while you can. I'll gather firewood, and when I've set up a small camp, you'll set to dinner if that's agreeable." Swain nodded and leaned against a half-rotten trunk that sat nearby. He quickly jumped up not a moment later and started shaking out of his clothing. Termites and small insects of other sorts fell from the folds in his sweater as he groaned uncomfortably. After a short lamentation of spiders and the feeling that they pressed into sensitive flesh, he gathered himself and curled into a ball on the floor. Finley chuckled at him, pulling a spare shirt from his backpack and tossing it to the oversized lump that his companion had become. "Put your head on this. Sleep on hard ground will only make you more tired," Finley noted, and before Swain could thank him or indeed even say a word, Finley was off and into the thicket beyond the clearing. Ever did the warnings over shepherd dogs and wolves gnaw through his resolve. Still, he pressed on until he found some already fallen branches. Thoughtfully, he removed his knife from its scabbard and held it in his hand. With no torch or proper lantern and only matches available as light, he was left confused by the repeating patterns in the tree bark and underbrush. He felt uncertain about how far he'd come in a short time, and moreover which way he should return. With the knife in his hand, he felt a rush of warmth through him that sundered the chill that the wind had glued across his tender and exposed flesh. He felt the urge to glance again at the reflection, if for nothing more than to remember what was held there. Again, the memory was vague, despite his having explained it already, and it only felt true once it was once again in front of him. He held the knife before him, staring at the reflection in the dull glow of the trees. Once more, he was vacant from the still image, and as the wind had died down for a moment, it felt almost like an odd painting was cast along the edge. He could see more clearly in the reflection than even his large eyes could see without it, and the trees themselves seemed distinct in a way that no normal glance could tell. For a moment, he had to recount the rules to himself, despite his desire not to follow them. As Everett had told him and retold him dozens of times, he was not permitted to fell any tree older than 10 years, nor was he free to fell a willow or an oak at all. He could gather what sticks and branches were already on the floor without overthought, but if he wanted larger wood, he would need to gather it, somehow, without killing a tree outright. He groaned. Never before had he been so frustrated by the silliness that he saw in such rules. "Respect for living things is fine, but it's damned cold," He sighed deeply, but in his mind, near to the back where unspoken thoughts sat comfortably, he embraced the warmth that his knife provided to him. As he'd explained, the knife did not feel harmful in the least and felt unlike anything else he'd ever held. It was like a salve or a cordial in the hand, a representation of creation and healing rather than a disassembly and death. He found a tall and sturdy tree, looking over what he'd been calling a knife since he found it. Only then did he consider that he might have been wrong in some regard. It was quite a large thing, spanning the same length as his forearm, and to some it might feel more like a sword. "Hardly a tool for chopping wood, but I've no option otherwise," he complained as he scanned up and down the thick evergreen before him. It rose many times his own height towards the star-filled sky and seemed to support the heavens like a column. He felt some guilt as he held the knife forward against the bark on the small branch near the base, but allowed it to pass as it was a fleeting concern. As he drew the knife across the branch's base, he found that it sliced well and cleanly into the wood. He reckoned that it must have been the sharpest thing he'd ever held, and was only further confounded by the feeling of safety that it provided. He wondered aloud to himself if maybe it was a defensive kind of safety, or otherwise the feeling that he was simply not in danger. As he wondered this, he sawed through the branch with the serrated base of the blade. It fell to the ground, and Finley sighed in relief, having finished the first act in a large number of possible mistakes as far as tradition went. At length, he realized that he was being silly. There wasn't anyone around to judge him, and after all, it was defensible at least to need firewood for survival on such a cold autumn night, right on the edge of winter's chill. Then, with a gaping mouth, he stared at the space where he'd cut the branch free. To his utter wonder, the wood that had been cut away seemed very green and quite lively. It was more alive than any fresh wood he'd ever seen, and so he judged that he'd picked a good and healthy tree to provide his safety for the night. Carefully, he picked the sparing branches that seemed correctly sized and not too packed together, and one by one gathered them in his arms. He was lucky enough to find an already fallen tree nearby a short while later, and felt a surge of joy as he did. The tree had fallen against a tall spire of rock. By nothing more than its weight, the somewhat thin tree had broken into several large pieces, of which one might be enough for a few hours of warmth. He returned the knife to its place, and gathered his sticks and kindlings in one arm, dragging the trunk of the tree back to the camp with the other. His mind was quieted by success and achievement. He had no trouble finding his way back to Swain, who was snoring pleasantly upon his return. Quietly and with great care, Finley prepared a pit of small stones, digging out a bit of raw earth to make a hole in the center, rather than to catch the dry grass on fire. He collected the shards of the termite-ridden stump and made a small pile of them in the center. Around it, he made a cone of smaller sticks, filled in the center by dry grass and the bark from the forest floor. After that, he chopped the log into 3 pieces, which proved to be a time-consuming chore, even with his exceedingly sharp knife. He didn't wake Swain until the fire was roaring, and with the large log that he dragged back to their camp, it seemed likely to roar for a great while. With a gentle hand, Finley pressed on Swain's shoulder and roused him from sleep. With a yawn, Swain rose and wiped his eyes, clearing the drowsiness away against the back of his hand. He still looked rather tired, but it was his turn to do his part, and Finley was quite spent from the day. For over an hour he'd been gone, and had returned aching from his long walk dragging a hefty trunk. If only for a half hour, he needed rest of his own, and handed his cooking pot to Swain with a simple command and the details of their plan. In my rucksack near the bottom, there's a healthy slab of salted pork. It's over salty, I'll admit, but with water and a few pinches of spice, it'll make a quick, toothsome bite to keep us going for a bit longer. We've got 4 miles or so to go, so we'll eat on the road. I'm just too tired to do it myself. Don't worry, Finley. I'll handle the food. You just shut your eyes while you can. I'll wake you when it's finished, no sooner. If time allows and Nim returns in that time, I'll even pack things up for us. And don't worry about the cook pot. We've no time, not enough spare water to clean it now. That'll be for later. Swain nodded. Finley lay on his pack and pulled the hood of his fur cloak into a small bundle. He placed his arms behind his head and stared skyward toward the stars. Deep in his mind, he thought about old stories that the stars could hold. He considered the constellations and the fables that were attributed to them. Like a storybook in his mind, he filed through them, and from a glance he knew them well enough to continue it even when his eyes had shut. He silently recounted the tales of Torhall the Bold and Lilith the Sly. He watched great battles behind his eyes, and subtle tricks echoed in his ears, voices far different from his own. Somewhere in his recollection of the story of Ilmig the Strong, he lost himself to uneasy sleep.